My guest today is Julian Vayne, who's dialing in from the UK. Julian, I have pinched a whole bunch of information from your website for my intro,
Okay.
but I have to do an abridged version. It's still pretty impressive though. So Julian is a British independent scholar and author with over 4 decades of experience with esoteric culture. From Druidry to chaos magic, from indigenous shamanism through to Freemasonry and witchcraft. Growing up in the Britain of punk and then rave culture, Julian immersed himself in the philosophy and techniques of magic. His journey into group ritual practice began within the Western esoteric tradition when he was 16. Since then, he has worked in ceremony and with practitioners from many different lands and lineages. Today, Julian is the author of books, essays, journals, and articles in both the academic and esoteric press. He sees his work as part of the process to help reimagine an earth-centered, non-dogmatic, open source spirituality. Thank you so much for joining me. I nicked the stage then.
No, Nadine, that's delightful. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's most appreciated, my friend.
Before I kind of hand over to you and you can give us a little bit of background or the short history of Julian Vayne to where you are today, a little bit of a backdrop. So I have kind of been interested in the use of psychedelics in terms of microdosing. Haven't done very much of it myself, like as a practice, but have a background in health and wellness and have followed sort of some biohacking communities, about basically just up leveling our health in lots of different ways, mentally, physically, spiritually, all of those things. And so I've become interested in this idea of microdosing. And I know that some people, are starting to do it more regularly as a practice for mental clarity, to help manage anxiety, and so on and so forth. My niece is in the UK, and she went to Breaking Convention, the convention that you're a part of in the UK, which is all about, I'm going to ask you more about it anyway, it's all about psychedelics, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so she told me about it. She said she had an amazing experience. She does some microdosing herself. And I was like, I really want to talk to someone. But then I went onto the website and it was like, there's so many of you. And I said to my niece, who do you recommend? And she said, Julian Vayne. And so
Oh,
I emailed you. And
I'm
you were
grateful for the
kind enough,
recommendation.
yeah, you were kind enough to accept the invitation. So here we are. I've again stolen a whole bunch of the limelight. You've barely said a word. So I'm going to hand over to you. If you could tell us a little bit about you, and then maybe we'll kick off with like just finding out a little bit about breaking convention.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Um, Again, thank you, your niece for the recommendation. It's interesting when we talk about it, my work in relation to psychedelics. So, as your intro explains, I come into this field from the extreme left field, I suppose we would call it. So, I'm not a therapist, and I'm not an academic researcher. I'm not a medic. What I am is I'm an occultist. I'm a person interested in um, the mystery of existence, our experience of being in these bodies, in this time, in this way, and so forth. And I'm interested in magic, and my working definition of magic is that it's the technology of the imagination. So I mean, this is the field that really fascinates me. It's fascinated me from basically as long as I can remember. If I'm being romantic, I would say that it was a vocation or a reincarnatory memory. If I'm being less romantic, I might say it's a mental illness. But from as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated by this whole thing, and I read loads of stuff as a kid. Got involved quite early on with Wicca because that was the most accessible form of esoteric sort of uh, practical kind of particularly group sort of activity that I could access. And then from that, I've worked as it says with lots of practitioners, lots of different styles of practice. So I come into this as somebody who is interested in altered states of consciousness, let's call them. So the kinds of things that we encounter in trance states, that we encounter with ritual, that we have, where we do meditation or drumming or chanting or all of these things. And one of the things that particularly fascinated me, and it fascinated me partly because of encountering the work of people like Aleister Crowley when I was young, was this idea that there were these strange and frankly magical kind of substances, which are the psychoactive drugs generally, but specifically the psychedelics. And Crowley, of course, is well known as being, the bad boy occultist, the sort of Elon Musk of the esoteric of his generation. Undoubtedly a problematic figure in many respects. But one of the things that he was very interested in was the fact that in the West, our re-engagement with psychedelics began in the end of the 19th century with the arrival of mescaline, which is taken primarily from the peyote cactus, the traditional medicine of a number of people in the Americas, areas that we now think of as Mexico in particular. And Crowley was very interested in this, and he was an early adopter, an early experimenter with a lot of those materials. And so, I kind of do my stuff. I join a coven. I get involved in sort of, ritual practice and so on. And then over the years, to cut a long story short, I became more and more fascinated with these substances, which it turns out have a huge lineage within what academics call the Western magical tradition. So the Western magical tradition is all of that occult stuff, all of that capital O occult stuff that you can think of, Cornelius Agrippa and, ancient Egyptian blah, blah, and all of these sorts of things. The lineage basically comes from North Africa, comes from Egypt, ultimately. So alchemy, things like that. And hidden within that tradition are lots of uses of mind-altering substances. They tend to be in incense. So it tends to be, if you imagine a sort of one of those early modern engravings of a magician in their room, and they've got all the things, and they've got the crocodile hanging from the ceiling, and they've got weird bottles and jars and things going on. They've got some sort of strange circle drawn on the floor, and they're shouting and pointing at things that sort of they're trying to conjure into existence. And one of the things that they're doing is they're burning incense. And if you go back and look at the history of the Western magical tradition, you look at what's called grimoires, which are the sort of spell books, essentially, of the medieval and early modern period and right up till today. A lot of those kind of techniques of altering consciousness, a lot of them pivot on the existence of ointments containing mind-altering substances and particularly incenses. So I kind of get interested in this field, and this becomes my kind of little obsession for several years. And then what starts happening is that broader culture begins to become more and more interested in these things. There is another wave of research that starts, I guess, with things like Gasser's research on LSD in about 2008. You could pin it at various points. But in the last couple of decades, basically, or the last decade and a half or so, the whole thing has really gone into a much wider awareness within lots of kind of cultural settings, not just in terms of, these drugs have been around for a while. LSD was available throughout all of that period after it was criminalized and so on. But this sort of re-understanding of these things in the light of two important factors. Number one is the repeat of scientific and therapeutic research that says, do you know what? These things, actually, there's some value in this, which is really interesting. So there's kind of that Western re-understanding of the potential of these, and I'll call them in this context, medicines. And also, to call them medicines in another context, there is the fact that there's a lot more kind of connection between many broader cultural stories and the story of what we could call indigenous or entheogenically lineaged communities. So ayahuasca and the people like the Shipibo, Conibo people and so on. The use of things like peyote and the Wararaka people, the use of iboga in West Africa and so on. So there's also this kind of awareness of like, oh, we are rediscovering again. We've done this 3 times now: early 20th century, mid 20th century, and now in the early 21st century. Turns out these things have a therapeutic and healing role. And it also turns out that there's a whole bunch of cultures busily using these substances in a variety of different kind of ways, which kind of, some of which sort of look like what we think of as therapy or healing. So if we take the example of Maria Sabina, so the very generous Mazatec lady who shared the use of the sacred mushrooms,
Yeah.
psilocybin mushrooms, back
Yeah.
in the 1950s, at great personal cost, I might add. You know, it didn't work out well for her, but her work was healing work. That's what, you know, you would go to see Maria Sabina, not necessarily to have some sort of spiritual epiphany, but to be better of some condition or some problem. So it's those two sort of strands that have kind of woven together. And I found myself as an occultist actually having experienced things to say within this world. Then there is this kind of emerging culture. I'm here in the British Isles in Devon, and there's an emerging story here with things like, you know, academic research, therapeutic research, breaking convention, which you mentioned, which I've been involved with for a few years now, which is the largest, and I like to think one of the most diverse conference on psychedelic consciousness. So it's all about all the different aspects of, you know, how we can be with these substances in the world and what they might mean for us. And that has also meant that I've become involved with being a research subject in some licensed research trials, writing on the subject and so on. So probably not as briefly as might have been helpful. There we go. That brings us up to date.
That was brilliant. Keep going. You got your turn after I stole the stage for the first bit. Amazing. There were so many things that you talked about there, and I love that you've part of this whole thing with life, health, and the universe. The podcast is like there are all of these threads that kind of start to connect together, and it sounds like that's exactly what you're doing. You know, looking at that kind of Western therapeutic academic, you know, research approach, and how that kind of, where's the intersection between that sort of spiritual or that shamanistic or that more deep cultural stuff. I'm really curious because I'm from Australia, and I don't know if this I'm sure you would have some insights for this, just historically, because you know the indigenous culture here, and this is not necessarily anything to do with drugs. I don't know if they've used psychedelics in their culture, but it's ancient culture, and there's a great deep respect for that culture. But I'm kind of like, I'm from the British Isles as well, and I don't actually feel like I know very much about the very far history and where we came from. And but we've obviously got some, like we all came from somewhere a long time ago. Um, I don't even know where I'm going with this, but I feel like
Yeah.
that there needs to be a bit more sort of respect or like exploration of those traditions that are part of where we come from, that go beyond kind of like kings and queens cutting off people's heads and having battles, right? I don't know if you've got anything to say about that, but I'm just kind of curious about that kind of
Mm.
like where we've evolved from in that kind of those small British Isles in that part of the world compared to some of those indigenous cultures.
I mean, the indigenous Australian, to use that name of the island, culture or continent, um, I know very, very little about its relationship with the pharmacopoeia of the herbs and plants of uh, those bioregions and that landscape. I suspect that there's a because there are lots of things in the Australian landscape, but notably the acacias, which have things like DMT, dimethyltryptamine in
Okay.
them, of which there are many. So it would surprise me, frankly, if for the tens of thousands of years duration of those communities that they haven't experimented and explored those things. But who knows? Sometimes people don't. Um, what we do know is that uh, the use there are various ways we can trace the use of psychedelics and psychoactive substances. The most common one in for the West, Western Europe anyway, that sort of comes in because of its connection with the Middle East is cannabis. So cannabis is uh, although it's not what we call a classic psychedelic in terms of the way it works in the brain, it is undoubtedly a psychedelic in a phenomenological sense, like what it does, how it feels. So that's a really important medicine. But what we also have to remember is that we're talking about, people often ask me, what about the Druids? What about the Vikings? What about all these people? These are people who didn't leave us very much or anything really in the way of written records significantly. There are things we can point towards and we can get into the guts of the history and kind of go, oh, this is interesting. Here's a peculiar sort of thing. There's various possibilities. What we do know is this, that there was a thing called the Temple of the Eleusis, the Eleusinian Mysteries. And people who are interested in looking at the kind of the indigenous roots of psychedelic, entheogenic culture in Europe and the Mediterranean should go and look at the Eleusinian Mysteries. So the Eleusinian Mysteries, very briefly, was the most important initiation of the ancient world through the Greek and the into the sort of the Roman Empire kind of period. It was a big temple that was about 20 odd kilometers outside of Athens, and every September there was a massive ritual held there. At the Temple of Demeter. Demeter is the goddess of the grain, and on the grain there is a fungus that grows called Claviceps purpurea, and that's the raw material that you use to make LSD. And there's circumstantial evidence, and I think as of a find that was made in Spain a few years back, some increasingly firm evidence that this was a huge psychedelic initiation ritual that vast numbers of people would go through. It ran for over 1,000 years. So it ran from the Bronze Age through to, I think, 399 AD, when it was closed down because a new religious movement had taken control of the Roman Empire in the form of Christianity. And the temple was closed. But before that, 3,000 people at a time were given this magical substance, a potion, essentially, a psychoactive potion called the kykeon. Kykeon is just a Greek word that means potion. And so there was the beating heart of ancient pre-Christian European culture. The most important ancient initiation was an initiation which included very likely the use of a psychedelic drug. And that's how it ran. And anyone could go along to this initiation. You could be men, women, the emperor, nearly every philosopher you've ever heard of went through this initiation. Lots of the judges, a number of the emperors themselves would go to it, but also people would just save up their life savings and do these two initiations in much the same way that a Muslim might do the Hajj, might do the pilgrimage to Mecca. So there you go. That's how it ran. And it ran like that up until the advent of Christianity and the Roman Empire becoming sort of fused as a monotheist patriarchy. It then stopped. Psychedelics then drops out of European culture, and it's counterfactual because we don't know what would have happened. But what happens to the culture is the culture then becomes this incredibly efficient, exploitative machine that rages across the rest of the globe looking for other drugs. And what it mostly finds are uppers and downers: cocaine, tobacco, coffee, sugar, distilled alcohol, opiates. And whenever it encounters psychedelics, it has a terrified reaction against them and basically bans them and disables the cultures that are using them. Now, if that was a human individual, on the basis of today's kind of use of psychedelic therapy to address things like addictions, we might say, well, you've got this terrible addiction to uppers and downers, haven't you? You've got this terrible addiction to things that get you up in the morning to run the machines and things that in the nighttime you use to self-soothe and shut you up because you're suffering. We have these other substances which are quite distinct from uppers and downers. They act in a very different way. And we can use those to help you as an individual maybe address your addictive, problematic behaviors. And that's what we might do to an individual. And what I would suggest is that as a culture, particularly the culture of people who have skin color like me, then one of the things that our culture has lost as of 399 AD was its connection to the psychedelic experience, which we know, when held in certain ways, is incredibly therapeutic. It has all kinds of other uses as well, and other difficulties and things associated with it. That's undoubtedly true, but we know that it has this therapeutic potential. So I think that coming back into our culture, and Lord knows it's taken a while. I mean, even the last 100 years, it's gone, we had a big wave of research in the early part of the 20th century. Then that stops because we got busy with 2 world wars. And then we started seeing these substances going out into wider culture. And then everyone got incredibly worried because terrible things were happening, like massive rock concerts where white and black people and men and women were sitting down and having a perfectly nice time together. And in the shadow of post-war America, yeah, exactly, weirdos, that was really frightening. And I can kind of understand how that was frightening. This massive social change happening in this way that's mediated by this stuff that people are putting in them, and then doing these weird behaviors like sitting on the floor or listening to music from India or whatever it was they were getting up to. And now, as of 10, 15 years ago, we're back to another wave, and it takes time and it's difficult work because in a way I think that some of the experiences that psychedelics can invoke in us, and the kinds of personal and therefore societal changes that they may create, are threatening to some extent to some of the power structures that exist at the moment. And it remains incredibly hard. I mean, I'm fortunate that I have, plenty of my mates are licensed legitimately in England or in Britain to, handle and to give out in research trials these substances. But even for them, it's incredibly hard for them to even get to the stage of actually starting to kind of apply some of this in terms of, medicine. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is what you're talking about indigenous, let's call it indigenous wisdom, just to keep it easy. How do those things influence what's going on? And the answer is that they do, quite significantly. And I can say that wholeheartedly because people from licensed settings come to me to ask my advice about how to set up their research trials, because they understand that what they are essentially running is a ceremony. And that's what I do. That's what I'm interested in. That's my background. Because even in the most kind of materialist, reductionist sort of approach to these substances, it's very hard not to come away with the sense that we are dealing with something that's not purely pharmacology here, or not simply pharmacology. We know that the environment in which we take these drugs is incredibly important. We know that we can optimize that environment to support people who are dealing with, let's say, an addiction. So there are plenty of friends that I've got in a variety of different nations who run licensed trials, and they talk about them often, not necessarily in writing, but they will always talk about them in terms of ceremony, And so yeah, there is a crossover. It is a very interesting, powerful, and of course, therefore, contested time and space.
It's really interesting what you said about that replacement of the psychedelics in Western culture specifically, and how there seems to be some kind of fear of them, but there like all of those replacement addictive things, and like how do you feel that emerges in a culture? Like, is that kind of like, going out and finding other things is it like to placate the people? Do we give them coffee and opioids?
I mean, that's
because
part. I was going to say that's part of it. I mean, if you look at let's look at World War II. Let's take an example like World War II. So one of the things that happened in World War II is the British spent an awful lot of energy making sure that tobacco supply lines remained open with North America, because tobacco is very useful. It's a drug which, taken habitually, is an appetite suppressant. It also allows people to maintain their focus. That's one of the reasons it's used ritually in things like the Native American church peyote ceremony. We use the tobacco to smoke when we pray because we're focusing our attention on the prayer. But also tobacco is a substance that doesn't sort of radically, particularly the way that it tends to get used, doesn't radically change people's awareness. So it can keep people being convenient cogs in the system, and cogs that don't have to go off and eat as much as they might have done otherwise. So I think that part of it is like, if we pan right the way back, and this is, I don't want to get too metaphysical about this, but part of it is about notions of fixity versus notions of fluidity. So the thing is that what you want is, I say you, like it's like some terrible group of people, but it's an emergent property from all of us in culture. What this style of culture wants is, it wants repeatable regularity in the body. And that's part of the reason that if you just do a Google search and you put human body in, you'll see pictures primarily of male bodies, or what appear to be male identified bodies, because women's bodies, they're always changing, aren't they? They're always having like fluctuations and things are going on. It's not the sort of thing you want. Then they do that, they go and get pregnant or have that's not what you want. You want fixity. You want kind of reliable, repeatable. This is a culture that runs around the clock, and the clock and the repetition and regularity of that is what you want. So anything that appears to disrupt that is problematic. Now, even psychedelics can be co-opted into that sort of system. Here we have sort of tech bros microdosing in order to be more efficient at the thing. Although there's still that notion that things like microdosing is actually about things like creativity. We know that creativity is not about pendulum regularity. It's about the unusual and the strange and the unexpected. That's part of it anyway. So I don't know if that answers the question.
I don't know what the question was. I can't remember. But it was great. And what was like about that? Whether like it's kind of like a deliberate. That was what I was asking. Whether it was kind of like a deliberate.
I think it's an emergent property.
But it's really interesting. And like, as humans, we generally, like you said, we like the certainty, the familiarity. We're not encouraged to sort of break free from that, right? We get pulled back in right from being a child who's, totally in their imagination and in their creative flow, and we just go, no, stop looking at that. It's just a leaf. And we kind of, it's behavioral, isn't it? Because there's that whole thing with like having habits and routine and familiarity that we can switch off. We can do it on autopilot. And I guess that whole other, the idea of creativity, flow, and like using psychedelics to open up this whole other part of life. It could,
It's a different way of seeing it. I think I understand. I think it's a different way of seeing it. Like, what happens for most of us, right, is that here I am. I need to do my accounts. Okay, I need to do my Excel spreadsheet. So I have to kind of take my awareness, and I have to focus my awareness into this thing. And that's a useful skill. That's undoubtedly a useful skill. And it's a skill that all human beings have. It's not that it's like special to people in the West or Euro-American, blah, blah. It's just a thing. But what we don't do so well, and what particularly those people who are kind of increasingly these days outside of like a pattern of shared religiosity with their community, who live nearby, all those sorts of things, what we don't do so well is if we think of a flashlight or a torch, there's that type of awareness, the awareness of focusing on the Excel spreadsheet. But there's also the awareness that's like the global awareness, like an awareness that's like more like a lantern than it's like a flashlight. And what psychedelics do, one of the things that they do, is they allow us to access that style of awareness more frequently. And that's incredibly useful. It's incredibly adaptive. It's incredibly helpful. But it's also the sort of thing that, historically, for many reasons, our education system and our processes as communities does not by and large encourage, and so that's part, I think, of the tension with these substances. It's like it's not just about like can we change the law so we can get these things recognized, how we can get, it's actually that I think that there's a recognition that these that psychedelics in particular have a really profound transformative opportunity for culture,
Mm.
just as they do for individuals, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess that's where kind of ceremony comes in, right? Because you're doing it in those group settings. Is that, would that be right?
I mean, it can be. I suppose, let's say, I'll give you an example. So in 2019, I was part of a licensed trial in King's College Hospital in London. And I, along with 6 other people, were going to be given psilocybin. It was a synthetic psilocybin. And we didn't know if we were going to get placebo, 10 milligrams, which is a sort of moderate dose, or 25 milligrams, which is a more significant kind of dose, let's call it a higher dose. I lucked out and I got the higher dose, which I was very pleased about. But what they did was the idea was this was supposed to be, well, it was the prequel for working using psilocybin to help people with treatment-resistant depression. So it's not something I suffer from. So I was in the group before that, so we could sort of test, does this system work?
Mm.
They dosed 6 people in a ward. Now, but what you have to understand is that if you do that in a normal ward with all the bleeping and the strip lights, everyone's going to get freaked out and it's going to be really weird and uncomfortable. And that's not what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do is encourage people to go inward. So the way that we tend to do that these days with psychedelic therapy is we give people eye shades and headphones. There's music on speakers as well at a low level. And the invitation is to go inward. In order to do that, you have to lower the light levels in the ward. So you have to have little LED candles and you lower the light level. You also have to do things like put rugs on the floor so that when people walk across the floor, it doesn't make too much noise. You also have to do things like tailor your playlist, because you're going to be listening to music, so that it follows the arc of the experience. So the playlist holds the person in this. You also have to have people who can support that person by giving them some encouragement, but without being overbearing or infantilizing or trying to direct their experience. So you have all these different components that have to come together, everything from what you put on the floor to how you arrange the music, to what your light level is, to how the people need to be in the space with the people who are tripping for it to work.
Okay.
In every meaningful sense, that's a ceremony. And then you can wrap other things around it. You can have, I've just been working with a licensed trial setting in the United States where they're doing psilocybin stuff. And they wanted a little, I guess, like a multi-denominational prayer or opening, a sort of something that could be accessible for people if they were like humanists or Sikhs or Christians, or it didn't really matter. So I wrote a thing which they're now using as a sort of a blessing or an opening process. It's very short, but they wanted that because they know that that makes a difference in terms of the way that experience will unfold. And I'm fortunate in as much as I've worked in that field for a little while. So despite the fact that I'm not a therapist or whatever, they come and ask me. And I can provide something that hopefully helps them with, what they're doing, because they're going to be doing some very good stuff, which ultimately will help people. So yeah,
How do they,
it,
with that research,
hmm.
were you 6 people on a ward to get like in a room, hospital room together? How do they determine um, whether this is it about the experience and about the environment and making sure all of those things are right if they decide to go forward with treatment? Or is it like, because obviously everyone's experience is going to be quite different, or was it about the amount of that you should dose someone, or what was the, how did they
I mean,
assess what the assess the outcomes or discover whether
yeah.
it was advantageous?
I mean, lots and lots and lots of sort of psychological questionnaires and lots of process around
Mm.
that to find out how the experience was, how it seemed to change people, and so on. And like I say, we were just like, we'd all met the criteria in terms of, physical health and mental health and blah, blah, so that we were all experimental subjects in
Yeah.
this. None of us were people with a diagnosis of depression, at least, at that stage. So, um, in the way that we would do that now in a kind of therapeutic context is that there is an emerging sort of protocol for how you do this. So if you were to rock up with treatment-resistant depression into a setting where they were licensed to use psilocybin, um, there are various kind of ways of establishing sort of, where should we go with dosage? Is it safe to do this? There's a whole bunch of stuff that kind of sits in there rather than, it's a fairly nuanced process from a sort of medical point of view. Obviously, lots of people are experiencing these things anyway in recreational settings, in medicine circles and spiritual kind of settings, in underground therapeutic settings. So there is quite a lot of knowledge being gathered about how we might do this well. We can do this work actually quite, pretty successfully. We know we've got a good idea now of who might benefit. And although the research is hampered by the legal situation, there are a large number of conditions that could certainly be supported by psychedelic therapy of one form or another, or psychedelic experience. And there are also plenty of conditions where sometimes, and we hesitate to use this word, there are sometimes people get cured of stuff. Yeah. And obviously anyone who's seen Fantastic Fungi or Netflix, How to Change Your Mind, knows some of the stories. Now, that doesn't always happen. And sometimes things, sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes there are problems, unsurprisingly, when you're dealing with a powerful thing, there's all kinds of stuff around that. But by and large, we can create these experiences. We know who these experiences best suit. We can make good strides towards holding the space for the experience in a good way, and also then helping that person to kind of integrate whatever their experience is. And so whether or not you have a terminal diagnosis and you're dealing with end-of-life anxiety, in which case the mushrooms probably aren't going to stop you having cancer. But they are very likely to be able to help you with your relationship with your experience of your own mortality.
Mm.
And we know that with a number of things like chronic pain conditions, Imperial College in London have just not long finished a whole series of bits of medical research. And they were looking and getting some pretty good results with eating disorders and chronic pain. So, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, all of these sorts of things. And the way the substance works in that sense is so really interesting, because what it doesn't do is it doesn't unmemory your bad experience. It doesn't ablate. It doesn't remove that section of memory. And neither does it do what antidepressants do, which are very valuable drugs. They're very, very valuable drugs. And for many people, many times they're incredibly important. But what antidepressants by and large do is they kind of narrow the emotional range. So you might not feel sad, but you might not feel incredibly happy either. So what psychedelics do is that they allow people to have this experience which allows them to understand what's going on for them in a radically different way. It's this lantern awareness. You step outside of the flashlight focus on whatever your problem is, and you see your problem from such a different perspective that often that's actually sufficient to change the thing.
Mm.
A good example of that is just to be had from straightforward mindfulness-based stress reduction and pain management. So we all know that mindfulness and practices like body scans can help us with managing pain, because the pain that you have, let's say you've damaged your shoulder, the pain you have in your shoulder, there's the actual pain in your shoulder, but there's also your anxiety about the pain in your shoulder. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Every time I move, I worry that I might hurt it. So a lot of the pain is the anxiety about the pain. So we know that by doing things like body scans and mindfulness-based practices, if we can reduce the anxiety about the pain gets less. So in a psychedelic experience that works well, we may not be able to address fundamentally the condition, although frankly, occasionally that is possible, but we can probably address your relationship with the pain. And more importantly, you address it through your own experience. You see, that's the interesting thing. It's not like someone's talking to you through this experience or guiding you towards a particular way. It's more like if you can create the right environment and you can find the person who is ready for this and you can prepare them in various ways, and then you can support them afterwards, you can drop this person into that experience in this safe container, as they sometimes call it these days, in this ceremony. And the process kind of works, and I'm allowed to use this word, magically. Like it works in a way that sort of is very, very, very often very surprising. It may simply be that these substances are clicking into action an inherent healing property that exists within the brain. And it may well be that these substances even exist, again, if we want to be really philosophical about it, maybe Gaia makes these things so that a monkey with a giant brain like us has a material that helps it activate this inner healing process, which works psychologically in the same way that my body has inherent processes that activate if I cut myself. So there you go, there's a bit more.
I like that. And I was like, oh yeah, I was going to ask something and now it's gone.
All right.
So I'm going to go right back to the ritual stuff because obviously when you did the research, you were in a group and you've talked about ceremony, but in this specific kind of therapy or treatment, the ceremony is for an individual, isn't it?
It varies.
Okay.
It varies.
Okay.
So there are in lots of kind of underground settings or settings where, I mean, I can fly from where I am now to the Netherlands and I can go and do a lot of this work and it's totally fine.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And so in those settings, sometimes I work with kind of, groups of people.
Okay.
And in fact, I'm part of a community where what we do is we teach people how to do this work, and we take 20 people over to the Netherlands, and you get half the group to have an experience, and the other group do what in the trade we call sitting for those people.
Okay.
And then a couple of days later, we reverse that process. These are all experienced psychonauts, all people who are already involved in this field in one way or another. So yes, you can do it for individuals. You can do it, you can do it. The minimum, of course, is 1-to-1, and plenty of people do that. And plenty of people are, that's perfectly doable. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because what you have to do in that is you have to kind of create a good environment where the person feels safe. The purpose of the ceremony is to help them feel safe. Okay. Right. So the ceremony doesn't have to be some dude with a crazy hat and loads of feathers or whatever, or shaking bones. It's about making that person feel safe. And the ceremony is everything that you say to that person, the way that when they're in the bathroom, you make sure that their water is refilled, the way that you provide care, but without being overbearing. That's how that kind of looks. The way that when you serve the food at the end of the ritual, at the end of the ceremony, you do it so it's really beautiful. There are all these tiny little details that are about making that person feel really safe so that they can do this deep movement inward to encounter the experience, which can unfold in loads of different ways, knowing that you're there. So you're kind of like like a nurse or a chaplain or a doula or a midwife. You're more like that. You're not kind of trying to direct it. You're just there to say, hey, you got this, no problem. If you need another blanket or a hot water bottle, I'll sort that out. That's fine. The Amazon guy comes to the door. We've got that covered. It's okay. You let go. You can, let them, go and do this work.
So that would be like they would be going more internal. So would you do the headphones and the eye shades and that sort of stuff as well, even if it's in a group? Yeah.
I mean, it depends. If it's in a group, sometimes occasionally people will have headphones as well. Usually you have the music just sort of ambient because it's easier than having loads of wires or weird Bluetooth things doing stuff. The thing is about the eye shades and the headphones is that is just the modern version of you travel to South America, the Shipibo people put you in the Maloca, put you in the kind of the ritual space. They give you the ayahuasca, then they turn all the lights off. Then there's the Icaros are sung. And the sound of the jungle in the background between the songs. Okay. So it's actually just the same. It's just a modern high-tech version of saying we're going to take the experience inward. that's what we're going to do. You can have lovely and certainly very healing and rewarding times taking, let's say, mushrooms and going walking with your friends or dancing at a party or whatever. That's great. That's absolutely lovely. But for that kind of self-transformative work, what seems to be most reliable is to invite most people to do this inward movement and to go inside, to and to have just the stimulation of, you know, maybe a soundtrack which is kind of like, you know, moving them through the experience, but hopefully not scripting it too much. I mean, you know, the classic way of doing this stuff is actually do it in silence, and there's some value in that. But for most people, having something that kind of helps them move through the journey is beneficial. You can do this stuff on your own, but again, for most people, having a friend that's there, who's experienced, who knows the territory,
Yeah.
you know, it's like you could climb down a rope down from a rocky ledge, knowing that the rope was well fixed. But if you climb down that rope from a rocky ledge, knowing that a skilled climber is at the top where the rope is, you probably feel a bit easier about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Same.
Okay. Cool. It sounds amazing. I'd love to talk to you about kind of. There's a couple of things. We're getting closer towards the tail end, and so I'm conscious of like getting some more stuff. But I'm really interested in. I think we're probably from a similar era. Growing up in the UK, you mentioned in your the intro that I read from your website about being in punk and rave. Did you mention raves?
I did mention
I was
raves.
well into raves. I loved raving when I was a teenager, and I'm kind of interested in this. Well, I don't know what direction to take this in. Like, okay, so there's probably two parts to this. The first part is like there was generally some kind of things involved, some dosing involved in these experiences, and there's a kind of like that ritualistic kind of, you know, people getting together, getting you know, loving it up, dancing. Um, so I kind of wonder if that is like has that been sort of like part of that cultural cycle that you're talking about? It feels like there's a lot of people our age that are now going, oh, those things that I did when I was a teenager, I can kind of start to see a different, like a connection to it. And like, oh gosh, where am I going with this? Like for our younger generation, like is our experience, has our experience as teenagers be and like coming full circle into our, you know, into our midlife, let's say, and understanding it from a different perspective, can that help with like the evolution of bringing it in to like younger generations? That was a little bit long-winded and kind of all over the
I
place.
think I know what you mean. I think I know what you mean. All right. So look, um, raves, by which I mean spaces where we are dancing and where there is probably MDMA, which is a psychedelic amphetamine, and is the daughter chemical of mescaline, which is the principal active ingredient of peyote. So this is a psychedelic ceremony. A rave is a psychedelic ceremony. It's an indigenous psychedelic ceremony invented in places like Detroit. It grows out of things like black disco. It grows out of industrial music. It grows out of a number of different kind of cultural influences. And, you know, I've sat with peyote with people from the Native American church, you know, in that kind of ritual style. And in that ritual, they play a thing called a water drum, and they play it all night long, and it has one rhythm. The rhythm is boom, 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 boom. Right? Okay. So the rave is an attempt by an industrial, post-industrial culture to kind of, with this substance that comes into it, which is basically a pro-social psychedelic. So it's pro-social because it's an amphetamine. It's uplifting. It's engaging. you know, you might conceivably want to kind of like lie down and chill, but possibly you want to dance, you want to interact with people and so on. So it's a way that we found, we meaning people of my, you know, with my cultural sort of background, we found a way of holding that space. And we developed two spaces. We developed the dance floor, we developed the chill out space, and they have different sort of, you know, architectures and different kind of, you know, stuff around them. And of course, what happened with ecstasy is it became incredibly popular, because a drug that makes you enjoy music and other people's company, why would that not be popular? You know, particularly a drug that is by and large remarkably safe. So because of that popularity, that was another wave. So we had that kind of wave in the 1960s with LSD when it escaped the military and laboratory settings and came into general culture. And we created a space then, actually. We created a thing called the Rock Music Festival, which was a space for holding the experience of being on acid. And then we created the Rave, which was a space for holding the experience of being on MDMA. And it was incredibly popular. Lots and lots and lots of people went there. Those people, I'm 56. So those people are now in those situations where, you know, many of the people, you know, lots of those researchers, did they go to raves? Of course they went to raves. Absolutely they went to raves. And the people who are kind of now going, oh, psychedelic therapy, is that a thing? Yes. But they know that because they, you know, they've seen, you know, how these things, also they've understood experientially how these substances, which were incredibly demonized and incredibly thought to be something, you know, they're still in things like UN Convention on Drugs, they're still continued, we continue to place them in the most dangerous category, despite all the stuff that I probably don't need to tell you or the audience about why they're not. And it turned out that these things were actually remarkably safe. And so lots of people who are kind of, you know, in the, you know, for example, my mates in their 50s had perfectly nice 20s and 30s raving, and none of them, you know, went mad or died or any of these sorts of things. But, you know, by and large, it worked out incredibly well. And that was even under circumstances where it was all criminalized. So you think, actually, maybe if it wasn't criminalized and we could test things, we could support people better, we could do, maybe we could actually turn this into a really lovely engine within culture, where it's just like, oh, you're 18. Oh, you're going to go to your, you know, do you know what I mean? It's like it's a rite of passage. It's a rite of passage, you know. And that might be great. That might be great.
I was going to sort of ask you, you know, well, for me, and I feel like that kind of night, that, you know, growing up, teens in the 90s, it almost feels like an initiation, right? But unfortunately, to a degree, because so much of it has to be kept secret, you don't really know what you're doing because it's all kind of like underground. You don't necessarily have the experience, or as good an experience. You can have a good experience, but you know, I took some LSD the first time I took LSD, it was like a disaster because I didn't know what to expect. I didn't have anyone holding space for me. You know, I was in a pub with a bunch of people that were kind of you know, and it could have been a completely different experience, but certainly an initiation. And I just think it's kind of interesting how that's yes, that our age group had that experience, and now there's this kind of like, now we're grown-ups, mature grown-ups, that we're kind of appreciating the value that it could have in the future for us as well.
Those people in the ancient world who were having their initiation at the Temple of Eleusis, 3,000 people at a time for at least 1,000 years. Yeah. So those people were doing that, and that was part of their story. And so many of us who've been to raves, yes, perhaps we have, you know, however inexpertly and however ignorant of or unable to access the wisdom of those who are more experienced than us, and having to do these things in, you know, illicit contexts, we had effectively created our own initiatory process. The experience of being on the dance floor, dissolving in your awareness into the crowd and being utterly yourself and also utterly part of all these people, and at its best, that is undoubtedly an initiation. That is undoubtedly an initiation in the sense that it is the beginning of something new. And even if you then kind of don't go anywhere near psychedelics, possibly even ever again, that has given you a new perspective of the world. And like I said, this is what these substances do. They don't, when people meet these again, when they come back to these things, maybe they've got to their sort of 40s, 50s, and then they go, oh, I need to sort myself out. Like there's a lot of people that I speak with who've kind of gone back to a more supported, carefully organized, thoughtful setting to reconnect with those things because they could see their value. They want to kind of engage with those in a different way. Long may raving continue. And may also those people who experience those things find ways to develop their practice, to develop their engagement with those experiences and those encounters. And I hope very much that we can change elements of the cultural conversation so that it becomes more accessible for people, because that's really, really important.
Yeah.
Really, really important. And it will change culture. Well, one of the things that happened when MDMA came to British culture in the early 1990s in particular was that overnight, pretty much, soccer hooliganism, football hooliganism stopped in Britain.
Wow.
Right. There's a lovely book that traces this, Ecstasy in the Dance Culture by Nicholas Saunders. What were violent pitched battles every single Saturday stopped. Now, we could have capitalized on that and built all sorts of things from that. People often sort of say, well, you've taken MDMA. They go, oh, wouldn't it be great if all the political leaders could all take MDMA, at least before they start a war? Yeah. But you see, the thing is, everybody laughs at that. But the funny thing is, or the sad thing is, they should be absolutely made to do this. Because before we light the touch paper on a war where vast numbers of people will suffer, this is a tool. These things are a tool. These things are an opportunity to change our relationship with our story. And we laugh at that, even though up until 399 AD, all of the philosophers you've ever heard of, and many of the emperors, I'm not saying that the culture was perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but those people were sat in the telesterion, the great initiation hall of the goddess Demeter, being given the kykeon, the sacred potion, which contained essentially LSD in it. And that changed their relationship with all kinds of things, including the notion of their own death. We know very little about what happened, but we do know from some of the accounts that people felt differently about their death. Now, many of the more unpleasant political leaders that we have, we know are people who have a kind of a rampant egotism and sense of their own self, and often a fear of their own demise and their own death. So what would it do to a culture if all of our leaders did have to undergo a psychedelic initiation? I mean, it might make things worse, although that's hard to imagine. And frankly, it is worth a try.
Yeah.
So all those people sat around in the raves back in the 90s going, oh, wouldn't it be good if all the... Yes. Let's insist on that. Before they send people to their deaths, let's insist on that.
Yeah. The reason I laughed was because I was probably one of those people that was saying it.
Yeah, me too, mate.
It was a familiarity of like, yep, I've been in one of those conversations.
Yeah. And you just go, well, okay, before you ask me to put my children in the firing line for your war, which will all, which probably after N years will look completely pointless and vacuous anyway, I would like you to have some sort of supported MDMA session, just as an individual, and then possibly in relation to the people who you're about to try and destroy.
Yes. Yeah.
So, worth a go.
Definitely. Okay, I've got a couple more things that I want to ask you. I want to ask you, and this is kind of a little bit random, but I think I'm just curious about it. You've been doing this work, and like you said right at the outset that you almost feel like it was, meant to be. You've been working in this with occultism, magic, psychedelics for 40 years, 4 decades. What can you tell me about courage? Because I feel like it's being left of center like that, left, far, far, far left. like you could face a whole bunch of ridicule. Maybe you didn't. I don't know. But like, what what can you tell me about being courageous in that, like in your journey?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. I'm very interested in that actually because courage is, again, talking about kind of classical culture, courage is a virtue. And I'm very interested in the idea of virtues.
Ah,
So I was writing, I'm writing another book at the moment, and I was writing today a little bit about virtues, which is that um, it's all very well to kind of like codify how you should behave, like to write lists of what you should do, what you shouldn't do.
mm,
But what I actually quite like is the idea of aspiration towards a virtue. And so there is a virtue called courage, and courage can be imagined as the middle point on a scale. And at one end, you have cowardice or timidity. You're not prepared to do anything. You're very frightened of the world. And on the other hand, the other extreme, you have being foolhardy, being too gung ho about stuff. And somewhere in between the two is courage. And courage is a virtue that you aspire to. So running into a burning building, by and large, is foolhardy, unless you're trying to save someone, at which point it becomes courageous. So the context of courage, the context determines whether an act is courageous or not. And there's no absolute answers to this, but I rather like the idea of aspiring towards a virtue rather than just trying to live up to a series of edicts that have been
mm.
printed out where, you know, different circumstances mean that sometimes those things are not the best way of articulating an ethical way to be. When you sit in front of a dose of psychedelics, that will be let's call it just a significant dose, a dose that will allow you to put on the eye shades and headphones and go into the deep internal world. That is courageous, because that work can be difficult because we all have all kinds of difficult stuff cluttering up the back of our heads. I know I certainly do. I imagine many other people do. And even if we don't have very much going on for ourselves personally, as a community, as a culture, as a species, we definitely do. So there's a courage in stepping into that world, you know, aside of even the legal situation, which is a whole other kettle of proverbial fish. So I think that I like the idea of the aspiration to a virtue of courage, and sometimes that's a continuous process of navigation. I'm very fortunate, partly because I could write about psychedelics because I'm an occultist, and so I could basically be written off as a crank. That's fine. I'm, you know, happy with that. You know, the guy believes all kinds of weird stuff. No wonder he believes that these substances are useful. So I was able to write stuff, you know, literally 20 years ago, which now people go, oh, that's a very good idea, or that's a bit wise, blah, blah. But of course, at the time, it was like, you know, small scale publications, little books, you know, like, you know, very narrow, small number of people who kind of were of similar opinions. But though that number has grown, and more of those people by kind of witnessing, as the Christians would say, bearing witness to, well, look, you know, I took some mushrooms and it's like the Bill Hicks thing, you know, I took some acid and I had a thoroughly lovely time, or I took some mushrooms that actually really helped with my PTSD, or I've started microdosing and now I don't have to take my antidepressants anymore because that seems to just do the job perfectly happily. So yeah, courage. It is important.
Cool. Thank you. One last thing. I'm going right back to a line that I used in your introduction and your work as part. You see your work as part of the process to help reimagine an earth-centered, non-dogmatic, open source spirituality. Have you got
Yeah.
any? I think that that's just wonderful. Have you got anything that you would like to say about that as we head to our farewells or close?
Sure. It's very easy when we get interested in, you know, any of these subjects, the esoteric or even health or well-being or whatever, to start to develop an idea that we are somehow better than everybody else.
Mm,
Oh, we see, I do this supplement, or I do this activity, or I do this other thing, and I'm of the opinion that if we have some um, good medicine, then we should attempt to share that good medicine. Because I'm of the opinion, like the Vajrayana Buddhists, that there's no point me being liberated until all beings are liberated. So I need to work on myself, whatever that means. But myself immediately implies others.
Mm.
And so that's what I mean by an open source spirituality. So I'm very, very, I spend all of my time, this is basically what I do, is I spend a lot of my time like sharing the stuff that I know with other people, working with them to develop their practice in a lot of different kind of fields. Um, Earth-centered because I think it's important that we think about our relationship with the physical matter and the species that we share the planet with. And one of the things about psychedelics is their stuff. Their stuff. They can be bought and sold. They can be given to you with or without your consent. They can, all kinds of things can happen to them. So by having a good relationship with this special type of weird, potentially dangerous, potentially incredibly healing, magical stuff, that's one way in which I see that kind of, relationship with the earth, aside of other kind of environmental, political stuff, which I'm interested in. Um, and non-dogmatic in the sense that we all tell stories about the world, and each one of our stories comes from a particular viewpoint and will illuminate something if we're able to really listen to other people's stories that perhaps we haven't ourselves seen. But it is also the case that we may see something which is obscured from the mind of others.
Mm.
And so without spending any more time, please God, saying, I have got the answer, you must listen to me, which is clearly nonsense. Anyone who says that is at best a little mistaken, in my view. I'm being really, I'm on an Australian podcast. I should be a bit more frank, but do you know what I mean? So it's like, um, so that's what I mean by non-dogmatic. It's like there are, it's a complicated world out there. So I certainly have no idea really how it works. And so, if we can just be a little bit sort of thoughtful about the multiplicity of interpretation of the world, then we will know more about it. Otherwise, we are like the wise men feeling the leg of the elephant and declaring that it is undoubtedly like a tree. And the other wise man feeling the ear of the elephant and declaring that it is undoubtedly like a fan. It's like we all know part of this.
Mm.
So rather than trying to tell other people that what you know is right, it might be better to invite this multiplicity of interpretation and see if collectively we can figure things out from there.
Love that. Beautiful. That's so lovely. Thank you so much. I've really loved having you here with me for this hour. Appreciate your time, yeah, in sharing your wisdom and teaching us a little bit about the magic.
Nadine, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really, really appreciated,
Yeah,
my
it's
friend.
been great.
I wish you every success.
Thank you. Ditto. Thank you so much, Julian.
Thanks,
Bye
mate.
bye.
Bye bye.